Obviously, there's a lot of disagreement that people have over moral questions and moral debates. We see that especially in our own time as we hear constant debates about human sexuality and gender identity and so on. It has been helpful to me in my teaching about moral theology and in my thinking about moral theology and ethics in general. It's very important, and I found it very, very helpful to go back to square one and to figure out what we think about and what the views are about human persons. What are we to begin with? What kind of being are we? What we decide about those sorts of questions will bring with it a host of conclusions about human behavior that follows from these different views. I found it very helpful because it at least allows us to get into the minds of one another and also to critique ourselves and see what model we are operating off of in respect to our own nature as human beings. Let me be more specific. It seems to me that there are three fundamental views of human nature, and each of these translate into a set of moral conclusions. So let me just describe them to you very quickly. One of those positions is what we might call materialism. In materialism, human beings are simply biological, material beings. There is no spiritual dimension, there's no transcendent dimension to human beings. That anything that we could appeal to as evidence of a transcendent dimension to human beings, like human consciousness and morality and so on, anything that we might want to appeal to as evidence of a transcendent dimension is really just the result of physical processes that are causing all of those things to be. You don't have to look far in the literature to find people who take this position, that matter is all that we are, just very sophisticated arrangements of matter, and that our very conscious life, that our morality, that our abstract thinking, that all of these things are simply the result of material processes at work within us. So that's view number one. View number two, maybe we could call it the Platonic view or a dualistic view. Plato famously talked about the body as the prison house of the soul, that our spirit is trapped in the body, that it's incidentally connected to it and related to it, but that the body does not really define me as a being. The body is not essential to my identity as a being. That gender and sexual identity and bodily aspects of who I am are peripheral and incidental to me, but not essential to who I am. The third view we might call the Aristotelian view connected to Aristotle, or the Thomistic view connected to St. Thomas Aquinas. In this view, the body and what we might call the soul or the spirit are intimately connected to each other. That the soul is, to use their language, is the form of the body. It's what's animating it. It's what's causing it to have the characteristics and attributes that it has. And that my consciousness and my conscious life is developed in relationship to that body. That the bodily way of being that I am is not incidental to who I am. It's essential to who I am. I am a bodily being with this interior principle of the form that animates and enlivens and shapes that body, shapes it in terms of its characteristics and so on. And that those things are not incidental to each other, but they are vitally connected to each other. Now, if you take these three views that I just quickly described, and you think about moral questions in relationship to them, you will see yourself coming to very different conclusions. For example, let's take one that would be fairly non-controversial. If you take someone who, let's say, lies to someone, let's say a student cheats on an assignment, in the materialist view, the reason why that person cheated ultimately has something to do with forces at work in them or physical mechanisms at work in them, maybe a survival instinct or something like that. But there's certainly no free will in the sense of the person determined itself regardless of the biological, physical, causal influences, that they were able to direct themselves by some kind of immaterial or spiritual principle that transcends all of that. That's not possible in the materialist viewpoint, at least not as it's traditionally presented. What about in the Platonist view? Well, this one is easier to see if we think about sexual issues. In the Platonist view, how might a person deal with transgender identity or maybe homosexual orientation? Well, in the Platonic view associated with Plato, uh, the the sexual identity of the person is only incidentally related to the body. So if a person sees themselves in feminine terms and their body doesn't correspond to that, well, in the Platonic view, those things don't necessarily have to align with each other anyway. Because they are two fundamentally different kinds of things. And they happen to be, for a temporary time, for a little while, they happen to be connected to each other. Sort of like me and the clothes that I'm wearing now. I'm incidentally connected to them. I can put something else on and change this. That doesn't define me on the inside. Well, the body is like that in the Platonic view. What about in the Thomistic or Aristotelian view? In that view, my body is not incidental to me. It is part of what defines me. It's an essential part of my definition. So that if I experience, let's say, homosexual orientation, and my body has an orientation toward the opposite sex, then there's something disordered in the orientation or the tendency of the person, and that's out of line. How do you deal with that? Well, those are different questions, but in the Thomistic view or Aristotelian view, this is a problem or it is a disordered tendency of the person. The Platonic view sees no necessary disorientation between these things because the body and the interior sense of identity would not necessarily have to align because of the dualistic or strong distinction between body and spirit. And then, of course, in the materialist view, the very moral question raised about what are ultimately biological causes is irrelevant to a moral conversation, however that conversation might go for a materialist at that point. So what I would like for you to think here before I finish is just think about how these three different perspectives influence our conversation as a culture and as a society. Think about someone coming from a materialist viewpoint having a conversation with someone of the Aristotelian viewpoint. The materialist sees that the desires of the person are simply biologically, physically grounded, and they arise from that biology. Whereas on the other side, the Aristotelian or Thomist sees the body and the interior desires as needing to align with each other, because the bodily is an expression of the interior. And when those two things don't match, then something is disordered and something is out of place. So I just throw those views out to you because I find them enormously helpful in not only analyzing the positions of the people that I'm talking with, but also analyzing where I'm coming from in the objections that I may give to certain moral positions or moral claims. In my own mind, just to throw it out there, in my own mind, the Thomistic and Aristotelian approach has the most appeal. The materialist view I find unsatisfactory. The materialist view sees the human person as lacking a transcendent dimension, and I think our very concern about questions of morality and what we are as human beings already rise above pure material causality, and that our ability to turn our attention back on the material world, back on our own nature, implies a transcendence above it in order to make of it an object for study and for reflection. So I think the materialist view is objectionable. The Platonist view, the dualist view, I think also is objectionable because I think we experience ourselves as bodies. We experience ourselves at our best, and when we are in normal functioning condition. Obviously there are cases in which people experience a disconnect between their interior life and their bodies. But normally we see ourselves in many ways as shaped by and expressed through our bodily presence in this world, and that shapes who we are. I'll never forget reading a book by the famous Edith Stein, who is a convert to Catholicism, but she was very famous for her work in phenomenology earlier in the 20th century. And she was put to death by the Nazis during the World War II era. but she was a very prolific philosopher, and she wrote a book called Woman. And I remember her writing about the experience of being woman, and she raises the question, how must it shape a woman's life to all her life, grow up from the time that she's a young girl, knowing that she has the kind of body that can produce and can grow within herself a new human life. And she reflects on how that reality, whether it ever becomes a reality or not, but how the reality of her body being a childbearing one and child-producing one, how that can influence and should influence a woman's development from the time that she's very young, really throughout her lifespan. So the issue of our view of the human person and how our identity is shaped and how it should be shaped in relationship to our body, as well as our interior life of the mind and the conscious level of the human person. This is an enormously important topic, I think, for thinking about morality.